Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us today for this important briefing. I'm Norma Ritz-Johnson, Lubbock Chamber Executive Vice President. We're going to go ahead and get started in just one moment as we wait for a few more folks to join the room. Just a reminder to please keep your microphones muted during today's meeting to avoid any feedback or noise interruptions. Before we get started, I'd like to extend a special thank you to our legislative sponsor, George McMahon Development, for helping to make our policy work possible at the Lubbock Chamber. At the Lubbock Chamber, since the beginning of the COVID outbreak and the business closures, our main focus has been doing what we can and staying on top of issues to help business stay afloat and keep paychecks flowing to Lubbock workers and their families, and to help business however we can. Part of that at this point in the crisis is helping Lubbock prepare for a safe, successful, and sustainable recovery of the economy. One of the important facets to that particular area of the economic recovery is having businesses be able to open with confidence when it comes to business liability. And so we're proud to be advocating at the Lubbock Chamber for business liability protections and reforms during this time for small businesses. And we're proud to partner with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on this. And so we're glad to be joined by Matt Webb with the U.S. Chamber today. He is Senior Vice President for Legal Reform Policy at the U.S. Chamber. He's going to be updating us on the state of play for business liability reform in Washington, D.C., and he'll give you all an overview of what the business community is seeking in new legislation, what they're working toward. We may have time after Matt has concluded for a few questions, so please be sure to type any questions into the chat function of the Zoom window, and if we don't have time to get to them, we will try to follow up so that we can answer those for you. And now I'm going to turn things over to Matt. Matt, thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to the information that you're going to be sharing with us.
Great. Thank you, Norma. Appreciate you having me today. But again, I'm the Senior VP for Legal Reform Policy at the U.S. Chamber's Institute for Legal Reform. So ILR is a separate affiliate to the U.S. Chamber focused on tort reform / legal reform issues. But everything we do obviously is very much in lockstep with the remainder of the Chamber building in DC. And but we have pretty much refocused almost our entire program, legal reform related, that is to deal with the liability issues that are arising coming out of the COVID pandemic crisis. And pretty much my almost full time at this point, looking and dealing with the legal reform issues and working on trying to get a federal legal reform package pushed through Congress as much as anything moves through Congress in an expeditious fashion. So what we are advocating for are timely, temporary, and targeted reforms in the COVID liability space. So we have formed a working group at the Institute for Legal Reform in conjunction with our sister organization, the U.S. Chamber Litigation Center, that started meeting very early during basically the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders and what have you, when the pandemic really started to take hold in the United States, to start looking at the types of liability issues that the business community was likely going to be facing as a result of the pandemic crisis. And out of that process came basically a series of 4 buckets of liability concerns that we immediately started working to develop policy proposals to address, and ultimately draft legislation that we have since shared on Capitol Hill. And now we're moving more into the advocacy phase of our work to try to get that legislation introduced, considered, and then ultimately onto the president's desk for signature. So the major issues that we're looking at in those 4 big buckets basically are dealing with things like exposure claims. So in other words, you have a customer or vendor or employee who alleges that they were exposed to COVID-19 in your facility and as a result developed the disease and suffered a personal injury because of that. So that would be the first category of, or types of, or category of claims that we're concerned about. And quite frankly, that's probably the biggest bucket of issues that we're really concerned about and dealing with. The second bucket deals with medical liability issues related to COVID-19, both for healthcare providers as well as healthcare facilities, such as skilled nursing facilities, hospitals, doctors' offices, etc. And then the third bucket deals with securities litigation arising out of the COVID pandemic. And then the fourth and final bucket that we're looking at deals with what we basically calling products liability claims. And it's dealing with things like hand sanitizers that are now being used to deal with COVID. The EPA approves cleaning supplies and disinfectants that are being recommended, as well as other types of health countermeasures that are providing very important protections, but then aren't necessarily receiving liability protections under federal law at this point, under a federal statute called the PrEP Act. So we're trying to make changes there. So what we are advocating for in the exposure space is basically saying that if you as a business are making your best efforts or a good faith effort to comply with the appropriate guidelines that are out there on how to deal with COVID, basically at that point, you should not have civil liability for someone who's had that sort of exposure in your facilities. However, if a business was shown by the plaintiff in a case like that by clear and convincing evidence, or basically a heightened evidentiary standard, to have engaged in gross negligence or worse, then there would be potential liability that attaches at that point. So what we're trying to do is walk a very fine line of, okay, if you're trying to do the right thing, understanding that we're all dealing with conflicting information, conflicting guidance, guidance that changes what almost seems like every 2 minutes, depending on which health authority you happen to be talking to. But if you're trying to make a good faith effort to do the right thing, you would receive liability protections. If, however, someone is engaging in particularly egregious misconduct, they wouldn't necessarily receive that liability safe harbor as a result of that egregious misconduct. In addition, we are advocating that those liability protections would be temporary. They would stay in place through at least October 1 of 2024, or if the public health declarations that the Department of Health and Human Services has put in place for COVID, which currently are set to expire on October 1, 2024, but if those get extended out, the liability protections would automatically extend out with those extensions of the health declarations. We're also pushing for federal minimal diversity for these types of claims. So similar to the Federal Class Action Fairness Act that takes large scale interstate class actions and allows federal courts to hear those. We're advocating for a similar sort of grant of federal court jurisdiction for these types of claims, so long as there's minimal diversity. The amount in controversy was exceeded $75,000 in the case. In addition, we're advocating for a 1-year statute of limitations for those types of claims. And we're also pushing for very strong pleading standards so that the plaintiff has to basically show when they file the complaint why they think and have evidence to show why the only place they really could have gotten the COVID disease that they're complaining of came from your facility versus someplace else. So it's So it would be a robust set of protections under our proposal. In the medical liability arena, it's very similar. Again, that gross negligence exception for healthcare providers and healthcare facilities. So if they were grossly negligent in how they were dealing with a COVID patient, they would not receive protections. But if they basically were following the appropriate normal standards of care, and there was a mistake in that sort of circumstance, in that case, then they would receive liability protections. In the security space, we are pushing for a moratorium or a stay on COVID-related securities cases. Basically, our perspective is that while we're trying to get the economy put back together as well as dealing with the pandemic, now is not the time to be dealing with securities litigation. We're not saying they can't file the cases. We're just saying that, hey, you can file them, but they're not going to be dealt with until after the pandemic's over. And so that way, try to get everybody back on something approaching an even keel, rather than having to basically deal with a dispute between what's in effect one group of shareholders suing another group of shareholders and having that other group of shareholders effectively foot the bill. So that's our major reform in that space. We're also making some other procedural fixes, as well as proposing a damages cap for securities litigation related to COVID. And then finally, we're trying to bring things like hand sanitizers, other types of personal protective equipment, such as the gowns, the EPA-approved disinfectants, as well as things that are being donated by the business community for COVID-19 to underneath the liability protection regime under the Federal PrEP Act that basically provides a liability safe harbor for those circumstances or those types of products as well. So where things stand is that Senate Majority Leader McConnell has made it very clear that before he is going to let a Phase 4 stimulus package be considered in the Senate, and primarily I think that was going to be something to deal with state and local governments as well as other areas needing additional financial relief. There has to be some sort of liability protection contained in the legislation. So he's made it very clear. He's drawn a red line saying that they're not going to deal with anything unless liability is part of that equation. He's working very closely with Senator Cornyn from Texas and putting together that package. And I know Senator Cornyn is very bullish on there being a liability package moving forward. In fact, I think he's going so far as to say that he's 100% certain that there's going to be one. But we're working very closely with Leader McConnell and Senator Cornyn on what those reforms look like in their package, and everything that we've heard from them is that for the most part, their views are in line with us as far as what they're putting into the bill. I think they're putting their touches on it as well, which I don't expect there to be anything that would be of concern from the U.S. Chamber's perspective. And I think that there's hopefully a fairly good chance that at least an outline of what their proposal is going to look like will probably be coming out, and I would say in the next week or so. I think part of what's going on is the game of chicken between the House and the Senate as it relates to how the Phase 4 legislation is going to be dealt with. Obviously, Speaker Pelosi over on the House side is very interested in putting a very large price tag on whatever that Phase 4 legislation looks like. And as a result, I mean, it's a legislative game of chicken right now. But I don't have any doubt, at least right now, that they're going to ultimately have a package. It's not a question of if, it's more of a question of when. And I think it's probably moving closer toward the 4th of July time frame when they'll probably be dealing with this, though it could slip into a little bit after the 4th of July. But again, everything's subject to change. Obviously, all the civil unrest that is going on right now could have an impact on that. And then also, depending on what happens with the overall pandemic situation as well, could have an impact. But I haven't seen anything that's going to change at least what I think the timeline is going to be. And then really it turns into a legislative negotiation between the House and Senate leadership, Senator Cornyn, as well as the requisite chairs of the appropriate committees on both sides of Capitol Hill on what ultimately ends up in that package. And but like I said, I have every reason to believe that there is going to be some level of strong liability protection that's going to make it across the goal line. And with that, I would like to open it up for questions. So.
Thank you so much, Matt. And I would encourage anyone to please post your questions in the chat function of the Zoom if you have any questions. I'd like to kick it off with one question, Matt, and that is, will there be any type of a look back or, what beginning, if legislation isn't potentially moved and passed and signed by the president until later this summer, what would be sort of the look back period, if any, where there might be some protection for business?
Yeah. So what's under discussion right now is some level of retroactivity for the legislation. We proposed the December timeframe of 2019 as the appropriate place to start the protection, because that's when COVID started to surface, at least as far as the public mindset. And I understand that Senator McConnell is thinking something similar to that as well. So, because we understand that everyone, particularly those that have been in the essential business category that have been open during this entire situation before the restrictions have started to be lifted, been having to make a lot of very challenging decisions without a lot of really good information, quite frankly, of what the best way to deal with the issue as far as liability is concerned. So that's why we've been looking at it from the lens of you have to have a retroactive element to the protections that we're talking about. And I think all the discussions with Senator McConnell and Senator Cornyn have been in that direction as well.
Does any of the proposed reform or relief address class actions specifically, or anything around class action type lawsuits?
Well, I mean, class actions, actually getting them into federal court would already be covered by the pre-existing Class Action Fairness Act. The liability protections would apply in those contexts as far as our proposal would be concerned. And I think, but a lot of these types of claims, quite honestly, probably don't lend themselves to class treatment in a lot of circumstances because of the individual facts and circumstances associated with the individual exposures. So I think in a lot of cases, they're not going to be eligible for class action consideration. But we are concerned that there will be attempts to come up with different types of claims. For example, what we call public nuisance claims, similar to what's been happening in the climate change and opioid-related litigation around the country, that they can try to concoct a public nuisance sort of issue or claim related to COVID against particular businesses or particular industry types. And as a result, that would be something that could potentially turn into either a mass action or class action sort of situation. And we're making sure that the legislation would cover that sort of scenario as well.
Okay. Another question that I have, and you talked about some of the nuisance lawsuits, et cetera. Are there any examples that you can give at this point of, I know at one time I did see some communication from the U.S. Chamber Institute for Legal Reform that you all were interested for local chambers to keep an eye out for any examples of potential litigation, any lawsuits that had been filed. Do you have any types of examples of anything like that, or even some industries that may be slightly more subject to liability claims than others that you've been made aware of?
Okay. Well, we have seen a increasing amount of litigation related to COVID. I mean, but it runs the gamut on a whole host of different types of claims. There's been a lot of litigation against the nursing home industry that's been filed, and then also some of the more speculative sorts of claims. For example, I know Walmart, for example, has at least one wrongful death claim related to COVID that's been filed against them by the family of a employee that died from the disease. In addition, there is a public nuisance claim that's been filed against McDonald's based on some issues that were alleged to have occurred in some of the restaurants. So it's right now, I think we're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg. And I think the plaintiffs bar is kind of playing kind of more of a wait and see attitude to some extent. And I mean, I know they're gearing up to do these types of cases. But I think what's really going to happen is that once businesses start to reopen and the economy gets going again and more people are out and about, and depending on how the disease ends up getting spread around, that's when I think we're going to start seeing a lot more cases. So part of what we're concerned about and advocating for with Congress is that you don't want to wait until you actually have all the cases filed. You want to deal with this beforehand. Because basically you see the storm clouds outside. If we're starting to see some initial raindrops, and we got to go out with the umbrella, quite honestly. And because going out and getting soaked and then coming back to get the umbrella, that's a little late at that point. So,
Matt, we had a question in the chat box, and I'll add on to that question a little bit because it was something that I was wondering, and that was in the chat box. This is under the exposure portion.
mm-hmm.
What exact requirements are they looking for to protect from being liable? I would tack onto that and ask. I know it's a balance probably that you all are seeking to strike, and that the business community, the business lobby, is seeking to strike in terms of, you know, we definitely want business liability protections, but we also want to ensure that, you know, to protect those businesses that have done their best and acted responsibly. There will be one or two bad actors in every, you know, bunch that, how are you striking that balance of still ensuring that where bad actors are concerned, those still can be addressed?
Right. Well, first of all, I mean, it's kind of a two-part question. So dealing with the types of standards that need to be put in place to provide the liability protections, we have not spelled out in our proposal exactly what those standards should be. Because again, part of the problem with what's going on with COVID is the fact that it is such a rapidly developing, basically it's a moving target as far as what you need to worry about and how best to address things. So for example, for quite a while, they were advocating that you didn't have to wear masks. Now they've changed their mind and that needs to be done. There was some question about how much the virus lives on surfaces, and there's a debate going on in scientific circles on that front. So we're trying to have as flexible of an approach as we can in a statute, and quite honestly, leaving it up and making it more in the guideline category. One of the things that we are concerned about as part of the overall legislative debate is that if it turns into a requirement that, say, for example, in the employment space, that OSHA issue a complex set of regulations, basically as a one-size-fits-all, cover all industries with everything you have to do in the workplace for COVID. That basically as a condition precedent before liability protection could be provided. We're concerned that that's not going to work, and as a result, so we're kind of pushing back on that sort of notion, because what works for say a taxi cab company doesn't necessarily work in a restaurant or a law firm or a car dealership or food processing facility or what have you. I mean, because they're all different industries, they all have different risk profiles and different ways of working. And on top of it, if you set a very complex regulatory scheme or put a very complex regulatory scheme in place, that's not something, one, that can be done quickly. Two, it's not something that can be changed based on new information very quickly. And as a result, it's just a recipe for just really messing everything up. So our push is to have guidelines put in place that would have some level of enforceability, but not be done from basically as a regulatory sort of way. As far as your second part of your question, dealing with the bad actors, what we're proposing is that if you are grossly negligent, and we've defined grossly negligent basically in the terms of if you're being reckless and how you're dealing with COVID. So I'll give you a good example. The way I described it is, let's say that you're a business that says that, okay, well, I disagree with all this. There's not going to be, I don't think this is real. In fact, I encourage you not to wear masks. I'm not going to clean anything differently than what I'm already doing. If you're coming in sick, I don't care. Come on in. I mean, basically pulling a bonehead maneuver like that, you're not going to get the protections. But if you're trying to make a good faith effort to do the right thing based on the guidelines that are already in place and will continue to be put in place going forward, then you would receive the liability protection. So, long answer to a short question. But
no, thank you. That was very enlightening. Another question that comes to mind for us, some state legislatures meet year-round all the time. Our state legislature meets every other year, and we are headed toward a session beginning in January. I know that a lot of the work that the Institute for Legal Reform has done in the past has been very close to what's going on in different states, because different states have different types of environments when it comes to the legal environment and business liability. So what will be the relationship, or is there sort of a state preemption, or will then, after hopefully achieving this at the federal level, then you'll have to go state by state? How's that going to work?
Well, in our proposal, it is a federally preemptive standard. However, what we are proposing is that it be a liability floor. So if a state goes beyond that and puts additional protections in place, those additional protections would apply. So we know in certain states, like Texas, where you have a strong and long history on trying to do civil justice reform, that there is a willingness and desire to potentially put potentially stronger protections in place. Other states like Utah have also done that already. Then we're not trying to supplant those. What we're trying to do is say that there's at least going to be a federal minimum level of liability protection based on our proposal. And at least all the conversations with Senator Cornyn and Senator McConnell so far have been along those lines. In addition, we at the Institute for Legal Reform have put together a series of what we're calling policy modules that are state-based reforms in the COVID space, very similar to what we've been talking about for our federal reforms. But again, understanding that each state is different and has its own legal environment and set of laws dealt with, but we are working with allies in key states, including in Texas, on these policy modules that are basically state model bills that could potentially be put together in the COVID space. So would be very happy to work with you as we're continuing our advocacy efforts as it relates to Texas as well as, and then also, but we're also looking in other states as well.
And that kind of bridges the way to my last question, unless there's any more in the chat, and that is, what can local chambers and our local chamber members do to help in this area? You've mentioned Senator Cornyn in this, and Senator Cruz, I know, has been supportive of the business community through this. What can we do to help in this process?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, continuing to communicate with Senator Cornyn's office and with Senator Cornyn himself on the importance of this issue. I mean, quite candidly, giving him the attaboys that he rightly deserves for his work in this space. Because I mean, he has definitely taken the bull by the horns, and you can't think of any better advocate out there, both from political acumen as well as substantive understanding on these things at the federal level. So it's great to be working with him and his staff on this. I would also encourage you to reach out to Senator Cruz and his office to make sure they fully understand the importance of this issue to their at-home constituency, and particularly the need for federal solutions in this space in addition to what's going on at the state level. So, I mean, that would be extremely helpful. And then reaching out to the rest of your congressional delegation so they understand that this is an issue for the Texas business community. The more they hear about it from home, the more they're going to be able to try to push things through the molasses-like federal policy process. So,
thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that. That was our last question. I think that's all we have time for, and we really appreciate your joining us for this today. I want to thank and give a shout out to John Gonzalez with the Southwest Regional Office of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for helping to facilitate Matt being able to join us today. We really appreciate his help and our relationship with John Gonzalez and that office as well. I do have a couple of things that are reminders. Hi, John, he's waving. I do have a couple of other reminders that I'd like to be sure that you have, and one is to be sure to continue to check back at our COVID-19 resource section of our website at lubbockchamber.com. And then we've also, just as a reminder, have launched a new site dedicated to connecting displaced workers with job opportunities and dedicated to small business recovery. We also have small business PPE resources for reopening safely. And then we also are going to be updating issues like this one at inthistogether.lbk.com is where you can find that type of information. We also wanted to give you a sneak peek. This has not yet been announced. We've actually, because you are on this call today, you're going to be the first to hear about it and to see that we are today going to be announcing that we've just published a playbook for reopening Lubbock business. It includes all of the guidelines from the CDC, from the Office of the Texas Governor, as well as from the City of Lubbock when it comes to safely reopening different categories and different types of businesses. We want to thank Lubbock National Bank for sponsoring that publication, along with support from Giorgio's, from One Guy on 50th Street, from Piper Boutique, and from Scarborough Specialties. So please be sure to check that out, and hopefully we'll get that website address put in the chat box. If it doesn't end up in there, please be looking in your email announcements for that. And again, it's the playbook for reopening Lubbock business. And it's got a lot of detailed information. Those announcements and those requirements and those different phases of reopening are continuing to be updated at every level. So we're going to keep that electronic publication updated with the information that you need. Thanks again to Matt Webb and the U.S. Chambers Institute for Legal Reform and the U.S. Chamber. And again, to our legislative sponsor, George McMahon Development. And thanks to all of you for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.